Hello, welcome once again to Pale Blooms and Beyond. Thank you for joining us today. How many of you remember the band Big Lost Rainbow? I see a few hands raised out there. Not hugely popular by any means, but the band released one album, 1973's self-titled album, which is a nice slice of contemporary baroque folk rock. The band formed in Connecticut, did some rehearsing in Massachusetts, then recorded a demo in Maryland in the summer of '73. The full album was self-recorded and released on their own label, Big Lost, in New Haven. The band toured for a couple of years, but with no interest from an established record label on releasing a second album, they disbanded in 1975. In 1992, the members had a reunion in Idaho. Well, my guest today is Jacques Bailhe, original co-founder and bassist for the band. We'll also talk about Jacques' very interesting life and career apart from Big Lost Rainbow. Well, welcome, Jacques.
Happy to be here.
So let's go back a few years. Where were you born? And talk about your childhood and upbringing.
I was born in Wilton, Connecticut, in kind of a Courier and Ives situation. My dad commuted to New York by the train, all that kind of stuff. And we had horses and grew corn and so on. And it was really kind of like frankly, like a Courier and Ives early childhood. It's, I guess, 13 or something like that. Yeah, about 13. And my dad came home from New York one evening and gathered the family at the table and said, kids, we're moving. And all of my brothers and sisters went, California? And he said, oh, we're moving to Bangkok, Thailand. And I was the only one in the room who went, yeah, hot dog. And they all kind of looked at me like, what? And I'd been homesick one day, and there was this TV show called Global Zobel. And this is back in the days when people's home movies were silent, 8mm or maybe 16mm film. And he would invite guests on to show their travel movie on their trip, And there was this movie about this place in Asia, in Thailand, where a city had monkeys all over the place. And there was a recognized monkey king, and the monkeys rode the buses from one end of the town to the other. And they lived like equal citizens with the local people, And I thought, one day I gotta go there. And so sure enough, ultimately I did. We moved to Thailand, and my father joined the State Department. He'd been in advertising for years and joined the State Department. And I guess we were there 4 years with the State Department. And then he left the State Department and joined Northrop Corporation, a big industrial airplane and aeronautics and manufacturer, and was their chief executive for Southeast Asia. But anyway, so I lived there until what? I guess I lived there, let me think about this. So I guess I could live there until 1970.
Okay.
And then I came back to the States to finish my high school. Okay. And so I went to a boarding school called Pomfret School in Connecticut again. And that's where I met all the guys in the band.
Okay. Well, backtracking just a bit, what were some of the earliest memories that you have of hearing music in the household, or either in either before you moved to Thailand or in Thailand? Was it accessible there? Could you?
Oh yeah. So in Connecticut, we had like a record player, like that, and radio, of course. But my brothers and sisters are the youngest of them is 4 years older than I am.
Okay.
So, and the range goes up to like 11 years or something. So I was born into like, early rock and roll. My parents really liked jazz.
Okay.
Jazz of that era and classic jazz. My father at one time sang on the radio.
Is that right?
And, yeah. And so he loved to sing and have a wonderful voice. And we had a piano and we had guitars and drums. My aunt bought me an accordion at one point for some reason. I don't know why. I actually kind of enjoyed it. But anyway, there were instruments around, and I took clarinet in school and then trumpet in school and stuff like that. I can't remember any of it. And so we're always in music, in Christmas time, of course, we go caroling, but I mean, literally like in a horse and with our sleigh and horse and go around the neighborhood with a bunch of neighbors and pull up on their yard and sing a song and drive off, And anyway, music has always been around.
Yeah, like picture postcard, like you said.
It was.
career.
It was.
Yeah.
It sounds silly to say so now, but as I look back on it, it really was that. It's the 50s and into the early 60s.
Did you take care of any of the horses yourself? Did you help?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
I had to haul the hay truck would always drop the hay off in the driveway of the house, but it was about I don't know, a couple hundred yards to the barn. So we would always have to load in the winter, load the hay up on a small sled and drag them all out and get them up in the hayloft in the barn. But yeah, so a lot of horse work.
Well, you mentioned your siblings older than you, so you're probably listening to a lot of the music they brought home.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, they were influential, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Can you recall the first 45 or album that you ever got?
Oh, may have been Beach Boys.
Oh, Beach Boys. Okay.
I think a Beach Boys record. Yeah.
Okay.
I didn't buy records because I was, little enough that I didn't have any money, and but my brothers and sisters were, of course, buying records. That's probably why I didn't buy any records.
Listen to theirs. Well, when you were in, I guess when you were in Thailand, you first took up drumming, right?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, yeah.
Yeah.
And
go ahead.
I had a snare drum back in Connecticut, and I liked hitting things. So it was satisfying to jam with the record. I used to jam on my trumpet with the record too. But anyway, but when I got to Thailand, some guys, said, can you play? And I said, I play little drums, And so I didn't have any drums. We left all that stuff back in the States when we moved to Thailand. But so I had to go buy a set of drums, and that was the first band I was in that was like an actual band.
Okay. What was the name of the band?
Well, the guy who was the real musician in it was a guy named Scott Smith, who I'm still in touch with. He lives in Hawaii now. And he was a really good piano player and had a lot of training about music that I didn't know from G to B flat or chords or anything. And but so he kind of ran the band, and his name was Scott Smith, like I think I said. And so I guess it was the Scott Smith Trio or something, or I don't know what we were called.
All right, used his name. Okay, but eventually you moved over to bass.
Yeah, I got tired of loading my drums in the taxi cab. Early Nissans, they were a Datsun, if you remember that trademark. But anyway, they weren't very big, so it was hell to get them all in there. And then I have to get to the show, I don't know, 45 minutes early to set everything up. And then at the end of the show, the other guys would kind of walk out and socialize and see the girls. And I'm like trying to tear down my drum set, And so I thought, okay, I'm switching to bass. So I got the bass guitar and never looked back. Well, I still play drums a little bit, but
yeah. A lot of high maintenance there on the
yeah. Yeah.
I could,
with no roadie, it's a bummer.
That's right. You had to do it all yourself. This is interesting too. You actually took some sitar lessons.
I did, yeah.
Yeah.
How did that was pretty exotic. This is around the time when George Harrison got his sitar.
Yeah.
And so we took a trip to India, just for the hell of it. and Nepal. And so I was just dying to get a sitar. And lo and behold, we happened to walk by a Indian music store, and they had the most beautiful instruments I think I had ever seen. There are all these ivory inlays and details and color painting on them and stuff. They're unbelievable to look at. And so my dad could see that I was really hankering for that sitar right there. And so astoundingly, they didn't cost very much. So he bought me one. And so my first lessons were from a hippie living in a tiny little teeny room. It was ridiculous. You had to like crawl through the doorway to get in Benares. And he gave me a few lessons. And then the really wonderful lessons were, we were in Kathmandu, Nepal for about a week after India. And
wow.
So Dad found a music store where the father of the guy who ran the music store said, yeah, he would give me music lessons if I could come back tomorrow. So I come back and I go in, and they usher me upstairs, which was just one huge room with a bunch of beautiful, lovely windows. And in not really the center, a little off center, but on the floor in the room, I'm not exaggerating, on the floor was a fire pit. And this is a wood building. But that's how they heated that room up there.
Yeah.
And so with the father of the guy who ran the store, this old, very nice man, he wasn't like ancient or anything, but he's pretty old. And so he sang the melodies to me and then helped me understand how to get expression and so on and so forth. I think. So I had a few lessons from him. But out the window was the top of Mount Everest. So this place really made an impression on me. And that was really beautiful. And then I played a lot after that when I got back to Bangkok. I really was interested in the sitar, and eventually sold it years later in Los Angeles, of all places. And now I've been dying to get one back because you're mostly playing on one string.
Okay.
But it is such an expressive instrument because the frets are metal hoops over the neck. So there's about that much space, airspace below the top of the hoop where your finger's going to press the string to like a fret. And the bottom keyboard, because there's sympathetic strings under there, like 25 sympathetic strings. But because of the height of it, you can get like 2 tones of bend on a string. So that's part of the technique of sitars. How much bend and how delicately you do it is if you listen to Ravi Shankar or somebody who's a master. But anyway, it was a really beautiful, interesting instrument to play.
Wow. Were you able to trek up into the hills, the mountains while you were there at all?
Well, a little bit. In Bangkok, you could rent a motorcycle. They didn't ask for your driver's license or anything. You just walk in and rent a motorcycle. But so in Kathmandu, I stumbled across a place who had motorcycles for rent. So I rented a motorcycle and had one of the great motorcycle rides of my life. Yeah, so I took a ride up a road that the Chinese had built from the northern border of Nepal down into Nepal, a paved, nice road. And so I rode for a couple hours up that road into central Nepal. And that was really stunningly beautiful.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine. Talk about being ordained as a Buddhist priest.
Okay, this gets crazy. So it sounds nuts, but in Thailand, you can't be a full monk until you're 21. But there's a long tradition of ordaining younger people down to kids. Okay. And it's one of the ways that a lot of families get their kid educated is by having them be ordained in the temple as a novice priest. And then they get schooling. But anyway, I went to my dad at the beginning of summer vacation one year and said, hey, listen, I was thinking, I'd heard that you could stay in the temples and they don't charge you any money or anything. And so I was thinking I'd take my motorcycle, at that time I owned one, and I would drive around because I really wanted to try to understand what the monks thought they were doing.
Right.
And so I just wanted to go see some temples and talk to the monks. And so Dad said, well, I have no objection, but let's check with one of our close Thai friends, who's comes from a very famous family in Thailand, Kraisi Niman Haman. Anyway, and so the next thing I knew, Kun Kraisi and my dad are standing in front of me in the entry hall to the house, and Kun Kraisi says, "So how would you like to be a monk?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "Yeah, you could be a monk." And I said, "You mean I could like actually be ordained and everything?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "But I have to go back to school in the fall." And he said, "Well, yeah, because in Thailand, people often go into the monastery for like 4 days. If there's a terrible tragedy in their family or something, they'll have an ordination ceremony and be in the temple for a few days and then come out."
Okay.
So I became ordained by, as it turned out, because Kun Kraisi was kind of a big figure in Thailand, by His Holiness the Supreme Patriarch of Thailand, kind of like the Pope of Thailand. And so there had never been a foreign novice. No patriarch had ever ordained a novice. And no foreign had ever been a novice. Patriarch had never ordained a novice. Oh, and no patriarch had ever ordained a foreign. So when I get to my nice, quiet, peaceful ordination ceremony, the Viharn, the building, was filled with press and television cameras. And my dad was a notable figure in business in Thailand, so it was all kind of a double whammy, and I hadn't expected it at all. I don't think my family did either. So anyway, I was ordained by him and lived in his temple for about, I don't know, 2-3 weeks. And then we had one of the great conversations of my life, the patriarch and I. And the long story short, he arranged to send me up to Chiang Mai, Thailand. Chiang Mai, a famous city in the north, very old city. And so I lived in that temple until the end of my my monkhood.
And you were how old at that point?
I was 17.
Wow.
Yeah.
What an experience at that age.
It was, I could go on and on because it was really, really mind blowing, but I won't digress too far.
Okay. All right. Well, moving back to music, what were some of the bands and musicians that you were into, on coming back to Connecticut when you first started performing, and when did you really start to get into folk music?
Well, that's the curious thing. I mean, I had learned on guitar, some kind of standard old songs, that were kind of folk songs, but I wasn't a folk musician. I was into the Beatles and Jimi Hendrix and jazz, always jazz. And so that was the music I really loved. And when I got to Pomfret, it was around the time that James Taylor and some of those guys were coming back on the scene after Bob Dylan had notoriously gone electric. And, so there was folk music around again. And one of the guys at school who was really the musical leader of the band, he and the other guitar player, Otis Reed, Ridley Pearson is the guy I'm talking about, who's now a famous novelist, 8 New York Times bestsellers. And Otis Reed were guitar players and songwriters and singers. And they played folk music and had for a long time. I don't think Ridley had ever been in an electric band, and I don't think Otis had either. Okay. And I'd always been in electric bands. And they were playing with a flute player named Tony Morse, who's now he's about to retire and go back to his illustration and painting days in Oakland. But he was a really good flute player, a lot of training. And Robin Fouts, who was a really amazing cello player. And so those guys had been playing, and they found out that I played bass. So they asked me if I'd like to jam with them, because they were jamming every couple of days in the chapel at the school. Mm-hmm. And I said, sure. And my bass playing at the time was still very weak. Okay. But they didn't seem to mind, and they said, no, A, and then play E, and then see, it goes around like that, A, E, like that. I know, okay, yeah. And so we started playing, and then another guy got onto it, Adam Berenson, who was a very good piano player, rock and roll and rhythm and blues piano player. He was the kind of guy that you could say, hey, Adam, you know what was that song that went, baby, baby, and he goes, oh yeah, baby, baby, I'm a Dixie Top, 65. I didn't even sit down and play, but he had this wicked memory for all these songs and could just whip them out. But so that was how we got started. Okay. And the next thing I knew,
did you guys hit it off from the get-go?
Yeah, we really did. We really did. Ridley and Otis have real gifts for melody and lyric. Mm-hmm. And so the melodies were really wonderful, and so were the lyrics. Musically, it was very simple, 3 chords and a turnaround. And things started to expand a little bit later, but anyway. But so, I don't know, we had jammed 8-10 times, and spring was rolling around, and Otis came in and said, hey fellas, guess what, we got a gig. And we all said, what? And he said, yeah, in New Haven, they're having this thing called Earth Day. And so we're gonna play a gig. So we all started practicing like mad. So we go to this gig in New Haven. And at one time I thought it was the first Earth Day, but I don't think it actually was. I think it may have been the second Earth Day, but okay. Minor trivial question. So we were to meet this guy who was gonna check us in or something. And so the guy comes up, and there are all these semi-trailers and stuff around. And he says, hey fellas, and we said, well, we're Big Loss, And he said, cool, well, where's your truck? We said, what truck? And he said, where's all your gear? I said, you're looking at it, man. And so I played the bass through an old portable Bogan amplifier because I didn't have an amp. And so he says, really? And they said, we said, yeah. And he said, okay, this is going to be good. Anyway, so we go walk out on the stage, and there are 30,000 people.
Whoa.
Yeah, that's what we said. And so they set up some mics for us, and we dove into our set, and the crowd was rooting for us. Obviously we were kids who had no experience or anything, but I think they enjoyed the music. I hope so. And we played to our standards. I thought, well,
could they hear you with that
amp? Bet they could. Yeah, you bet. Well, probably not with much of the bass, but Ridley and Otis, their singing, their harmonies together are really, really good. Yeah. And I'm sure if nothing else, beside the flute, Tony was really kind of a virtuoso flute player, and the cello, I'm sure, made quite an impression on them. But anyway, that was our first gig.
We'll talk about whose idea was the name of the group. Can you remember where that came from?
I do not remember who came up with the name. Probably just tumbled out of a brainstorming session.
Okay, so you did. That was your first gig.
Yeah.
Did you play any more before you moved to Massachusetts for some more rehearsing?
Well, it gets a little complicated because we all eventually deferred our college and met up in Redwood City, California.
Okay.
And so we fumbled around out there for, I don't know, 6 to 8 months, and all sorts of other adventures intertwined. And then we all went back to college.
Okay.
And, or I think most of us did anyway. But then during that year of college, everybody's talking on the telephone and not particularly thrilled and would much rather be playing in a rock and roll band, well, a folk band. And so we all left college and met up on Cape Cod, and that's where we tried to set down our roots and make a run at it as a professional group.
Okay. Why was Cape Cod chosen?
Tony Morris's family lived on Cape Cod, and they had a lovely house that had room enough to put us up for a week or two.
Okay.
And then somehow or other, probably no doubt Otis, because he always had made contacts with these people and developed all these great things for us. Anyway, we met a guy who was a real estate developer and residential real estate. And so he had some empty houses. So he said, I'll get a house here, move into the house. So we moved into the house, and that's how Todd Holland was his name, became our first producer.
Okay.
And so he loved the band and really helped us a lot. And we started playing gigs, and eventually moved out and rented our own place when we got enough money to rent a place. And that's how it all took off.
Okay. And then you recorded the demo in Maryland. And again, I'll ask you, why Maryland?
Well, another guy came along. He had gone to school with Otis Reed's older brother, Charlie Reed.
Mm-hmm.
And his name was Tom Eigelhart.
Okay.
And his family he really enjoyed the band and was excited about the band and everything. And his family had a really beautiful old farm down in Maryland. And near there, in Easton, Maryland, was a recording studio. And so he said, hey, listen, you guys need to make a demo so you can send it to record companies. And so he said, I'll pay for the recording, and we'll make a demo. So all of us went, demo, never heard of that. Okay, cool. And so we had no idea how the business worked. So we go down there and recorded for, I guess, a week, and recorded a bunch of songs and did fine mixes on about 4 or 5 of them.
Okay.
And then we had tapes, reel-to-reel tapes of the final mixes. And when we got back to the Cape, we were mailing them to radio stations. They played, I guess, a radio station in Boston and a couple other places, if I recall, played some of the tracks off the demo tapes. Mm-hmm. And we were trying, make record contacts with Nat Weiss. I don't know whether you know who he is. He was a bigwig in James Taylor and anyway, a bunch of other famous musicians in New York. And we got our record in front of what's his name? Anyway, big Columbia producer. But mostly what we did is we made cassettes and we would sell them at gigs. Okay. And then that got out of control. So I dug around and found this ridiculous, well, not ridiculous, that's insulting, but they were an educational record manufacturer. They didn't make like Columbia Records LPs, but they made, records, real records. And so we printed 200 records and silkscreened the covers in our basement. Tony was the artist, Tony Morris. Okay. And those sold out in a gig or two. Wow. And so we made another batch of like 500. The first batch was printed with white covers. And interestingly, they're listed, you probably know, but there's a whole collector's universe of these old records, right? Mm-hmm. And So the white album is listed as ultra rare.
Okay.
And we were astounded to see people paying like 60, 80 bucks for it.
Yeah.
But at any rate, then that was the white album was 200, the first batch, and then we reprinted again with black covers, and we made about 500 of those, and those eventually sold out.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's the record.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, I've
And that
skipped
was-
a beat. I skipped
go
a
ahead.
beat because we only had like 5 tunes that were kind of properly mixed. When we decided to print the record, we went to a studio in New Haven, Dynamic Sound Studios, and recorded some more tracks to make a, what we felt was like a complete record. I can't remember, there are 9 tracks or 10 tracks on it, something like that. But so that made us feel like it was a real record.
Well, how was it? Let me ask you about being in a recording studio for the first time. Was it a little intimidating, or what were your memories?
Yeah, it was intimidating. So most of us had 0 recording experience. And for some reason, I knew a little something about the actual technique of recording,
Okay.
not necessarily music application, and the engineer was really helpful. I wish I could remember his name. But after a day or two, we got in the swing of things.
Okay.
And the engineer, made sure we were, not popping in the mic and getting too close and all those kinds of errors. But it was intimidating because it was still pretty early in the band's life. And so, we only really had, maybe 8 songs that we could really nail. And even those, one of the characteristics of the band was Ridley and Otis had pretty much set guitar parts.
Okay.
Otis was kind of playing lead guitar. And so his leads or breaks were not the same every night. He improvised those essentially. And the cello part was, some of the songs had a specific intro for a few bars, like you would do with a head arrangement. But for the most part, everybody knew the song, but there were no set parts for the flute player, the cello, or me on the bass. And so it got a little risky, because on occasion we would go different directions. So we were all pretty tense about trying to stay in the same harmonic universe,
Right.
But one song I'd never played bass on yet. Ridley and Otis always played that together, but they wanted to really produce this. So we got a studio musician to come in to play pedal steel on it.
Okay.
And then they all got excited and said, we got to have bass. So Ridley blithely said, hey, Jacques, can you play bass on this thing? And I said, okay, sure. So he kind of not hinted, he said, so try this, it's just a descending chromatic scale for these notes, and then you can do all your jazzy stuff, but then come back to that scale under the chorus there, And so he really taught me how to play this song. And so I had like one pass through to try to get used to it.
Yeah.
And then we recorded.
Yeah.
And I recorded and I did like one punch in where it wasn't that I'd made a mistake. It was I just didn't like where I had gone from this note to that note.
Okay.
And that's the take that's on the record. That song is called Brothers of the Future. But Ridley really helped me a lot with that. And it's still, for me, one of my favorite bass parts I ever played. I just love that bass part. Yeah. Okay. I never would have thought of a descending chromaticism,
Yeah. Well, it sounds like your interest in jazz helped color the sound of the band too. Yeah.
A little bit, because they were always saying that I was always complaining that I should learn how to play bass like a real bass player, because I just didn't stick to the 1/5 stuff in my sense of rhythm. Yeah. Most of the stuff we were playing was in 4/4, but I have I don't know what inclination towards syncopation and stuff like that. And so my bass parts got a little exotic. Underneath a lot of these songs. But what would happen is sometimes some lick or something I'd play on the bass, the band would start to pick up in the song, because we're all listening to each other as we're playing night after night. And suddenly it would become like a part, where we'd all at that point in the song play that riff, you know. But anyway, I do think that my bass player added kind of an exotic, you know, most folk songs, not all of them, and I don't mean to be disparaging in any way. I wish I could play classic bass like that. You know, it's pretty 1/5 and stays on the tonics and like that, you know. And I didn't. Yeah. And I was frequently playing rhythms that nobody else was playing.
Right. Well, it seemed to work out though.
Oh, rather.
In listening to the album, you can tell the musicianship is top notch, really.
Well, that's nice of you to say. We never felt like we were top notch. I'll tell you that.
There's a lot of talent. I mean, if you really listen to the album, and you mentioned, you know, some of the instrumentation with the flute, the cello, and the piano, giving it that nice baroque sound. I think that's what really makes the difference in the album. And the singer, you brought up James Taylor a couple of times already, has that James Taylor quality, you know. Yeah, in the voice, which is nice, you know.
You know, we recorded again about I guess it was maybe 4 years ago, and made a record called 600 Moons. But it was really fun to have all the guys out here for a week. And I have a studio, you maybe can see a little bit in the background. But I moved all my gear into our living room and moved all the furniture out and everything. But it was really, really fun to play with them all again. We had, as I think you mentioned, we had a reunion tour in 2009 where we played, I don't know, 3 or 4 shows in Newport, Rhode Island, and Providence.
Yeah.
But it was really fun for us to get together for a week and play. Now, Otis still plays all the time. He's a guitar teacher in Providence with a huge number of clients and everything, but he plays almost every weekend shows. And Ridley is the kind of person who could not play for 4 years and pick up his guitar or bass. He's a wonderful bass player, and play anything you want. His ear is so great, he just can catch on the tune immediately and knows where you're going. But anyway, some of the other guys didn't play that much. Like Tony doesn't play that much anymore. And but we played the songs again, and you know, got them together. And then I spent almost a year, because no one was here, so we'd have to do all this by email and sending stuff around, mixing and editing the parts. But yeah, so the guys keep threatening to book gigs again, and I say I'm out of the gig game, I'm telling you. But I suppose if they booked gigs, I would probably go back and play the gigs.
So when you guys got back together, the magic, as they say, was still there. Yeah.
With some pushing.
Okay.
Yeah. You know, you probably are well aware, but especially when you're playing largely improvised music, if you don't play it frequently, even though you know the song, you're not hearing each other well enough, and you're not sensitive to where you know that guy's going to go.
Right. And
so we didn't do all that many takes on these songs, and we laid down basic tracks and did overdubs and things like that. But if we tried to play just off the cuff as an ensemble again, we'd need a week of solid rehearsal before we could really kind of make some nice music.
Right. Yeah,
Except for Otis and Ridley, those guys who play.
Yeah, get sharpen, hone yourself a little bit. What I wanted to mention a few of the tracks on that album that are my favorites, and then I want to get your 2 cents worth, or maybe more than 2 cents. It's Over Now. That's my favorite track on the whole album.
You know what? It's really interesting. Ridley would play that song at gigs as a solo. There were a couple songs where he'd play a solo.
Mm-hmm.
And then at one point he worked up a little arrangement to have an intro with the cello and the flute.
Yeah.
And an outro. I guess they played through the song a little bit too. On the album, I don't think you can really hear the flute. But it's a beautiful flute part. But anyway, and really wrote all that out. Those guys, all those other guys, can read music. Some very proficiently, and some can read fine. I could never read, and I still have trouble. I can't really sight read. I mean, I work in notation all the time, but to actually read while I'm playing is another thing altogether,
Yeah.
But anyway, but so he wrote all that out, and it's one of those songs that is so simple in its sound.
Mm-hmm.
It just seems to cast this spell. And that's one of the things that Ridley could really do in his songwriting.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many other songs, those guys, their back book, if you will, is 250 songs, 300 songs.
Mm-hmm.
And on the new album, we have some songs that were obviously not from this era. Over Now, however, is on the new album, but redone in a way. But Ridley had a particular penchant for being able to write these songs that would, when we were playing a show, like in a bar, we played a lot of bars. And so, there's dish clatter and people laughing and talking and everything. And there were some songs he would play and the place would just go silent.
Yeah.
And it would really cast a spell.
Yes, yes.
Otis was always, he has some very, very beautiful songs, but Otis tended to be more energetic music.
Yeah.
He liked to hit his guitar, it was always breaking strings. But yeah.
Well, that's when you have something too, when you've got the audience's attention like that. Was that a fan favorite, Over Now?
Yeah, that and a couple of Otis's that you would not have heard, I don't think. But one called Always on the Eve and a couple other songs that had that same effect, but in Otis's style, more energetic.
Yeah.
But they would get people's attention.
Well, following closely on the heels of It's Over Now, Lady Love is probably my second favorite. That's a really nice track.
Another great tune. So another classic Ridley tune.
Yeah.
That's Otis and Ridley on the piano. So Ridley's playing a kind of a basic part.
Mm-hmm.
And Otis is doing his thing all over it. It's really kind of in a pentatonic scale, just because they decided that Ridley, when he wrote it, played mostly on the black keys. But that was a weird one because we hadn't played that much when we recorded it, as I recall.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a high wire act when we recorded that song. But once again, as you say, it's one of those songs that there's something really captivating about it.
Yeah.
And I would say it's the harmonic movement against Ridley's melody.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously the pace and the movement, but musically, Ridley could really make those passages really really gets your attention.
Yeah. Another one, my favorite's on there is Slow Rider.
Another Ridley song.
I guess I like Ridley's writing. I like his tracks.
Yeah. So
yeah.
Ridley, I mean, Slow Rider for the gigs on the album, we just really did it kind of as a straight up folky vocal song. But when we were getting better and playing, gigs all the time, that turned into kind of a not country, but electric guitars.
Okay.
And we never had any drums.
Okay.
And so it had a different sound in later years. Yeah.
And a couple of more. I Go Alone. Are you going to tell me that's another Ridley?
That is a Ridley.
Okay. Well, it shows you the type of music I like.
He'll be excited to hear you picked out his tracks.
And then Allegiance of Apathy. I like
now, Allegiance of Apathy was not on the original album. You may be listening to the album.
Okay.
A guy called us up years ago and said he wanted to re-release the record on vinyl and CD. Okay. Gear Fab Records.
That's where I picked that up. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that's a Ridley song, and we re-recorded it for the album 600 Moons.
Okay.
Because on the track I think you listened to is just a solo, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and so we played it as an ensemble on the new album 600 Moons.
Okay. Well, you mentioned earlier that the copies that you guys produced sold out pretty quickly.
Yeah.
The first go round, the second go round, and that was there locally, right? I mean, that was up there in the Northeast.
We spent most of our time gigging around New England.
Okay. Okay.
There were some places up in Vermont we played frequently, and around on the Cape we played a bunch, and then other gigs that would come up. And then I think you mentioned we had 2 tours we did.
Yeah.
Across the country. We called them the Virginia tours because we never went near Virginia. But and some of those were much bigger gigs, college gigs.
Okay.
So more auditorium size gigs.
Okay.
But we mostly played bars.
Okay. Well, on the national tours, did you play with other bands?
Like a first act, yeah.
Yeah.
No.
No, it was just.
I'm trying to think if we ever did. I don't recall ever doing that.
Okay.
We would get booked in to do a show.
Okay.
At a college auditorium, as I recall.
Okay. Any memorable gigs when playing across?
We did, however, play a gig as a first act on Cape Cod in an auditorium for Livingston Taylor.
Okay. Yeah, James' brother. Yeah.
Yeah. And we were all excited because a big producer said he wanted to talk to us after the gig and stuff. And so he came back to the dressing room and he was really excited about the music. And he said, I think you guys are fantastic. You could really go places, I can help you do that. And he said, I was thinking, you guys should wear ascots and so you got to remember Otis perennially played in blue jeans with holes in them and sometimes barefoot. We're in like a gig someplace, he's barefoot. And so we were pretty scruffy, and we were all thinking, ascots? No, I don't think so, man. And so we said, no thanks. It was stupid. We probably should have said, sure, ascots, whatever you want, sombreros, we're ready to go. But we were too stupid, and said, no, we're gonna wear no ascots, bud. Yeah, that's the only gig I remember. Well, no, these were not auditorium shows, but we played a bunch of clubs that were pretty big rooms. And so I guess the first time we spent about a weekend playing like a first act to Dave Van Ronk.
Okay, right. The full team. Yeah.
And got to know Dave a little bit. and he was encouraging and really nice to us. But at one point, I think we played like a whole week, alternating sets or something with him. And one night at a place up in Vermont, not exactly a big bar, it's kind of a restaurant bar, but they had a stage and everything, a bar area. And we were playing, and as it turned out, there was some kind of a bagpipe band competition going on nearby in Vermont. And for some reason, I don't know, 3 or 4 of the bagpipe players had come to our gig. And so we heard they were there and went over to say hello and then invited them up to play with us. And so we did a version of Going Down the Road by the Grateful Dead with bagpipes. But they were really great. They were great guys. We had a lot of fun. It was a nice sound in the band. It was more like oboe or something, you know?
Okay. Oh, I love an oboe. I love it.
Yeah, me too.
Favorite.
And so it worked well in the sound of the band.
Yeah. It was that wasn't recorded for posterity's sake, was it?
Regrettably, no. Well, no, I take that back. When we were recording a lot of charities and some of the other places, we had a 4-track TAC tape recorder, and we'd record every show.
Okay.
And there is a mass of tapes in Ridley's possession, many of which are probably ruined by now, but there are hundreds of hours of live gigs.
Wow. That would be something if they're still workable, you know, and you could reproduce those or master those in some way, you know.
One of the weird things is the 1/4 inch from those days seems to have held up better than, for instance, the master track to the original demo tape.
Really?
Yeah, I can't explain it, but there are some tapes from that era that you could still play, and they're okay.
Yeah.
Now, granted, no Dolby, not very good engineering settings, so a wee bit of hiss here and there, and we're just taking a feed out of the live PA system, you know. So people are yelling into the mic and clattering and all sorts of stuff going on. But anyway, it's fun to have them. And one day, Ridley keeps saying he wants to go through them, and I said, "Yeah, that'd be great." And he said, "So I'll send you the tape recorder and the tapes." And I think, you mean you want me to go through them?
Yeah, we mean you.
Yeah,
That means you.
maybe we'll get to that one day, because I know from the old days, a silly anecdote story. One of our good friends was a girl named Pam Fraser, and she was a big supporter of ours and stuff. And so we were getting ready to go. We were living on Cape Cod, getting ready to go to a show, and we get in the car and we start driving, and it's the Grateful Dead playing Going Down the Road Feeling Bad.
Oh yeah.
And so I'm listening to it thinking, man, I just love those guys. They're so good. And I turned to Pam and I said, God, why can't we sound like that? And she looked at me, she said, that's you, dummy. And I said, what are you talking about? She said, yeah, that's you from last night. I said, what? She said, yeah. So I was astounded. I thought it sounded pretty good. But for a second there, I thought it was him. But there are some good recordings.
Yeah. We'll talk about after the album you guys released it, were there any critics or writers' reviews of it?
There are. I don't know whether I put them on that Facebook website or not. I can email copies to you.
Okay.
But we saved some reviews. Let me think about this.
Yeah.
I don't think we ever got the album reviewed at the time that we made the album.
Okay.
The album was, I think, the only reviews I've ever of the album, not gigs, but of the album, was some years later. But from the guy's interested in old records and in rare records.
Okay. And that was of course, the onset of the internet really helped out there.
Yeah.
Yeah. When did you first start hearing about the resurgence and interest in Big Lost Rainbow?
Well, to tell you the truth, we were flat out stunned when this guy called us up from Gearfad Records and said he wanted to reproduce the record. We said, "What are you talking about?"
Right, right.
And so, so that got our attention, and then, as you say, the internet started going on, and then the weird thing to me is I would be on YouTube looking for some music or something, and I'd come across tracks from our album.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, what, are you kidding me? And some of these tracks, guys would put them up, they'd have, 800 plays, 1,000 plays or something. I thought, really, 1,000 people listen to the record? And but now, interestingly, I find there are more and more of them. And some of the quality is not very good. Like one site had the whole record.
Yeah.
And so I got in touch with the guy and said, listen, I got no objection to you putting our record on the internet. Thank you very much. But here's a Dropbox link to the tracks, so you have some clean tracks, because those don't sound very good. So if you put the clean tracks up, I'd really appreciate it. And he did. He was very nice.
Right.
But yeah, I don't know. There's I guess 3 or 4 songs from the records that seem to have a lot of attention from people. Not a lot. I mean, for God's sakes, with it's ancient folk music, but a surprising amount of interest.
Right, right. I think I when we first spoke, I sent you that link to the I do that, post a bunch of songs on my YouTube channel, and most of them are very obscured, like Big Lost Rainbow. And you'll get comments, from people and saying like, "Wow, why didn't I hear about this band earlier, back in the day?" And this is great stuff.
Here was one of the things that was so much fun for us. I guess it was the first night when we did the tour, the reunion tour in 2009 back east.
Mm-hmm.
The first gig we were playing was at a club called Billy Good's in Newport, Rhode Island. And so it's a restaurant and club with a listening room. And so all the guys are there and old friends, and Tom Eigelhart came, one of our old producers, and we won't let him off the hook. We always call him our producer. And he says, "Oh, I'm not your producer." I said, "Yeah, you are, for eternally." Anyway, but anyway, so we were all goofing around eating dinner before the show. And what floored us is a couple people brought the album and asked us to autograph them. And we were like, "Oh my God, really? We get to autograph? Too cool." But it was fun. And a lot of people, I guess our fans from the day, because we did have fans in the day, not millions of them, but, they really remember those fun nights. Like there was a club in Newport we used to play a lot called the Salt.
Okay.
And had a really nice room. And I always remember it as a place where we played some of our really best gigs. We sounded really good.
Yeah.
So a little digression, but
yeah.
So I read a lot and try to teach myself about music. And so I realized one day that I always felt like I never liked modern classical music from from Schoenberg for those terrible years through the 60s and 70s. I just never liked it. I couldn't understand any of it. Okay. And so I thought, but that's not fair of me, because I'd never heard half this stuff.
Right.
So I got a book on modern classical music and started reading it, and they would mention these composers and their tracks or whatever compositions they'd written. There wasn't a single track, no matter how bizarrely obscure, that I could not find on YouTube.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
I was astounded.
Right.
And because I had the idea that YouTube was kind of a pop thing. I don't know. But it's amazing the repertoire,
Right.
the archive of repertoire that is
Right.
on YouTube.
Oh yeah.
It's
Oh,
just, I mean, I don't know, it still floors me to this day when I'm snooping around for something. The producer I've been talking about, our producer, Tom Eigelhart, he has a fascination with, it's not all obscure, but some of it is obscure music. Well, obviously, I had a fascination in us, so he'd fit in that category. But he has quite a collection of tracks and records and things from that era,
Yeah.
from the not that era, but through his lifetime, and is an enthusiast for the off the beaten path,
Off the beaten path.
wonderful gem, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Undiscovered gems. Yeah. Like digging up one. It is. It is. And it's fascinating. And then when you connect with other fans as well, you know, the comments that people post on there, you know, like I said, it's like, wow, you know, I didn't know this existed. You know, I knew this band, but I didn't know of this song, you know. And it's just, it's a good feeling, you know, to put that out there, and then people, because you know as well, I mean, you've been in the music business, that if we just depended solely on the record companies to put out what they thought was going to be good, you know, then what kind of, you know, stuff are we going to have out there, you know? If we didn't have, I always tend to, you know, like on a single, A side, B side, I like to flip it over. I always like to listen to the B side, because a lot of times, yeah, it's a better song. The record, the label was pushing the A side, you know, and a lot of times you'll hear the bands going, you know, members going like, oh, we hated that song, you know, but the label pushed us to produce that. So
you're touching on something that amazes me now. So not only with the band's new album, 600 Moons, but with my own work, I can pay a few bucks to a distributor, TuneCore, Distrib, CD Baby, like those guys.
Yeah.
And upload my tracks and press a button, and I'm on over 200 websites around the world with publishing and sync right control.
Right.
And so what I love about that is not only the ease of use for me, but just what you're talking about is people who can't get a voice.
Right. Right.
Can get a voice on YouTube.
Yeah.
And you hear about it very frequently these days, where somebody totally obscure, nothing, no contacts, nobody, never played a gig in their life. They make a YouTube video on their phone.
Right.
And it goes, you know, 80 million hits. And suddenly the phone's ringing. But the thing that kills me is that anybody who wants to write a piece can put it up and offer it.
Yeah.
And they may not get a big, huge audience. I don't have a giant audience. Big Loss certainly doesn't have a giant audience. But I have an audience, and it's satisfying to think people are listening to your music. And you know, that was impossible for 1,000 reasons, not only the production reasons and all that kind of stuff, but just impossible, you know, 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. Couldn't do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. I think it's great for us. You know, it has destroyed the record company business.
Right.
And so it's frankly hurt artists' revenues.
Yeah.
But maybe there's at least some trade-off in that unknown artists who would never get a shot now have a big time shot.
Yep. Yep. And the whole home recording studio, you know, off of your own personal laptop, basically. People doing that kind of stuff, just recording, and especially with the COVID, that really forced a lot of songwriters and composers to do that. I mean, you couldn't really go out, so I'm going to start writing some more material and composing things. So
It's
it helped.
incredible that for not very much money, or even just your phone,
Yeah.
you can make a nice sounding recording.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, if not a really professional sounding recording.
Yeah. Yeah. But speaking of composing, talk a little bit about your after leaving the band and how your career kind of picked up. You went.
Well, to keep it short,
Yeah.
after the band days, I went to art school and studied filmmaking.
Yeah.
And made a documentary and so on, won some awards and stuff. And the documentary business at the time was, maybe you could get it on a network, but mostly you made a deal with educational distributors to distribute your film to schools or wherever they thought they could distribute it. And so we had a distributor and they distributed the documentary. But it was like a feast or famine business. It would take you 6-8 months to get funding and the project together.
Mm-hmm.
Then you go shoot it. Then you edit it. Then you spend some time trying to get it distributed. And then you say, okay, good, got it. Now I'm going to go make another one. And you call all the people you called before, and they're not there anymore because it's been 1.5 years or 2 years. And I go, who? So I said, okay, look, I got to get a steady job. I want to make some films. So I got a job in advertising, my father's long career before we went to Thailand, as a producer. And so one of the great things musically that occurred is I'm suddenly in sessions with some of LA's finest composers and studio musicians who can play anything, any way you want, anytime. One take, maybe two. and great engineers, Capitol Records, Studio A, and well, from my point of view, Serious Education, for which I'm forever thankful. And learned a ton about how things go together. And then I was always playing my bass and my guitar and stuff, but then I got a piano.
Okay.
I love the sound of a piano.
Yeah.
And so I have this little baby grand piano, and I would just play for relaxation. But then suddenly in the sessions, the professional sessions, people started showing up with DX7 synthesizers, if you remember that instrument at all. Okay. But it became a big deal and they were everywhere and the sounds were everywhere. And I noticed that, by golly, that really did kind of sound like a clarinet. And because I had always eschewed the synthesizers and I wanted live players, And but they were starting to sound like real instruments. And so I went out and bought a bunch of Kurzweil gear, Kurzweil keyboard and some other outboard gear. And just completely irresponsibly wrote a 90-minute symphonic piece.
Okay.
Which has taken me 15 years to actually organize and notate and correct properly. But but I just dove into it and I just fell in love. It was amazing.
Yeah.
And so then when I retired from advertising, I don't play golf.
Yeah.
I don't have these other kinds of pastimes, but I've always been writing music. I've written some for advertising, Dolly Parton, and so on and so forth, jingles for her amusement park and stuff like that. But I just decided, well, so I'm retired now, so I can just sit in my little home studio here and write away.
Yeah.
And so some of the pieces on my first album I released, a jazz album, Shiva in Flagrante, I wrote the basic tracks of those, some of the songs 10, 15 years ago.
Okay.
But I never thought I'd do anything with them. I just wrote them because I felt like it.
Yeah.
So then I tuned those up and stuff, made it into a record and released it on the internet. But I've also written a lot of other pieces, some of which are, I tend to mix genres. So some of them sound classical, but then they get very jazzy and then they go back to classical. Because I love counterpoint independent lines rather than chords. So independent melody lines, I love that. But anyway, so I've been having the time of my life releasing
Doing that.
Tracks on the internet. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you found out that's your calling, I would say, you know.
I don't know about my calling. It's partly my obsession.
Okay.
And then when things are going well, it's my bliss.
There you
But
go.
I hasten to add, there are days when I don't feel blissful about it.
Right.
I have to tell you, when I was learning how to notate and working on the big orchestral pieces and stuff, I thought, you know, this is humiliating. I mean, there were no corrections in Mozart's pages, you know. Okay. But then as I was reading the history stuff, I like to do that, I came across some Bach and some Beethoven autograph scores. And there are huge passages scratched out with obvious fury and rage. And I thought, oh, there's hope for me yet.
Right.
That encouraged me. Because I do rip things apart.
Yeah, right. You know, well, I guess if everything was smooth sailing and you were in a blissful state all the time, it really wouldn't be worth it. You have to have those down times and to balance you out too.
That's what they say.
Yeah,
I wish it was just all beautiful every time.
walking on air and in the clouds all the time. Yeah,
Yeah.
I do too myself. Well, it sounds like though it's been very a rewarding field for you, the composing and doing that, the self-composing yourself too. And there's no real pressure. That's the one thing too, from a record company to say like, we need another album out, you know, we need singles out, you know. So you work at your own pace. You know.
Well, I've been asked to write some things by a pianist here in town. She's a classical pianist, over the years. And so I always have to say, okay, so love to do it. But I have no idea when I'll be done with this. So is that okay?
Yeah.
Because I mean, I wrote under pressure for commercials, but I don't ever want to write under pressure again. Right. Just because I know I might turn something in that a year later I would say, wow, that's really not okay. And I want to change it. So I write these things at my pleasure and pace.
Right. That's yeah. It's good that you've come to that place in your life to be able to do that. Yeah.
Well, I have the preposterous luxury of being able to do that.
Jacques, can you think of anything else you'd like to add? What's on the immediate horizon for yourself?
Well, I've gotten really interested in writing for dance. I avoid saying ballet because they're not ballets, but they're like modern dance things or whatever. I always seem to have like a story in my head when I'm writing music. And so I'm about to release in a few days, March 20th, I think, a new piece for 2 pianos and 2 cellos. Okay. It's a dance piece called A Mother's Tears about gun violence. But it's taken from Vivaldi's Stabat Mater. I don't know whether you're familiar with that song. But there's some beautiful melodies, and so I kind of jam off those melodies and stuff. But the sound of 2 cellos and 2 pianos is really interesting to write for.
Oh, yeah, I imagine so. And that's a subject that's really current and has been for some time. And
Yeah, we got to do something about that.
yeah, we really do. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just ridiculous. Yeah, the idea that schools are supposed to have armed guards
Yeah, right,
to protect the kids.
right.
For me, right there says, okay, this is really backwards.
Yes,
Something's goofy.
right. And the just taking it from, when you and I, because there's not that much, maybe one, generation between us, but when we grew up, most neighborhoods, left their doors open, didn't lock them, kids would stay out, till dark and what have you. And then look where we are today. It's,
Yeah. When I grew up in Connecticut, it was just like that. There were no doors were locked. Everybody left their keys in the car.
right.
That way you didn't lose them.
Right.
and in my whole childhood,
Mhm.
in our little town in Connecticut, there was a murder.
Yeah.
But it was one out of whatever it was, a long period of time. Conversely, when I get to Thailand, we had a house in a compound that had walls around it, and there were intense precautions about thieves and so on.
Yeah.
Mostly petty thieves, but thieves. You were unlikely to get killed, but they were sure take your money. But somehow we've gotten into that mess where the thieves and the crooks are running rampant,
Yeah.
Anyway, another subject.
Well, yeah,
Greg, thank
definitely.
you so
Definitely.
much.
Well, yeah. Thank you.
doing
Thank you.
this.
Thank you, Jacques. And it's been real enjoyable.
I really enjoyed it, Greg. You do a great job. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate it. All right. All right. We'll be in touch, okay?
Yeah, good.
All right.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.